you will never leave this prison. You will spend the rest of your natural life behind bars." Judge Thomas Harrison's voice resonated through the packed Cuyahoga County Court of Common Pleas in Cleveland, Ohio, his words carrying the full weight of a sentence that would shock the nation and reignite fierce debates about juvenile justice. The defendant, standing before him, 13-year-old Christopher Dixon, showed no visible emotion as the judge pronounced the most severe sentence available under Ohio law: life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. In the gallery, family members on both sides wept, some for the victim, 34-year-old Michelle Dixon, who had been 8 months pregnant when her son killed her. Others for Christopher himself, a middle schooler who would never experience freedom again. The case had captivated the Cleveland area and drawn national attention for the unthinkable nature of the crime. A 13-year-old boy had shot his pregnant mother in the head while she slept, then attempted to make it appear as though she had taken her own life. This court has presided over many difficult cases during my 23 years on the bench, Judge Harrison continued, his gaze fixed on the slight figure before him, a boy who looked even younger than his 13 years in his oversized suit jacket. But I have never encountered a case quite like this. The evidence presented during trial demonstrated a level of calculation, deception, and callousness that defies comprehension. You murdered your mother while she slept. You murdered your unborn sibling. And when confronted with the evidence of your guilt, you showed not a moment of genuine remorse. Christopher Dixon stood motionless, his expression blank, displaying the same disturbing emotional flatness that had characterized his demeanor throughout the investigation and trial. His court-appointed attorney, Maria Santos, stood beside him with tears streaming down her face. Tears for a client she had fought desperately to save from this fate. Tears for the tragedy that had destroyed multiple families. Tears for a justice system that had just condemned a child to die in prison. But to understand how a 13-year-old 7th grader came to be sentenced to life without parole for murdering his pregnant mother, we must return to the beginning, to the troubled Dixon household and the toxic family dynamics that would culminate in a crime so shocking it would challenge our fundamental assumptions about childhood, criminal responsibility, and the capacity of young adolescents for calculated violence. The 911 call came in at 7:42 a.m. on November 8, 2022. The caller's voice high-pitched and frantic in a way that immediately signaled genuine distress to the experienced dispatcher receiving the call. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's calm professionalism provided a stark contrast to the panic on the other end of the line. My mom! Something's wrong with my mom. I think she's dead. There's blood, and she won't wake up. The young male voice was choked with sobs, words tumbling over each other in apparent terror. Okay, I need you to stay calm. What's your address? The dispatcher began her protocol while simultaneously alerting emergency services to what appeared to be a medical emergency or possible death. 1847 Riverside Drive, Cleveland. Please hurry. I don't know what happened. I just found her like this. The caller provided the address between sobs, his distress seemingly authentic. Is anyone else in the house with you? The dispatcher's question addressed immediate safety concerns. No, it's just me and my mom. My stepdad is at work. He works night shift." The caller's response established that only he and the victim were present. "What exactly did you find? Is your mom breathing?" The dispatcher attempted to assess whether this was a rescue situation or a death investigation. "She's in her bed. There's blood on the pillow. And there's a gun on the floor next to the bed. I think she shot herself. Oh God, please send someone." The mention of a gun and blood immediately elevated the situation from medical emergency to potential suicide or homicide. "Help is on the way. I need you to go outside and wait for the police. Don't touch anything. Can you do that?" The dispatcher's instructions followed protocol remove potential witnesses or suspects from the scene while preserving evidence. Okay, I'm going outside now." The caller's voice faded as he presumably moved toward the exit, his continued crying audible until the call disconnected. Cleveland police officer Rebecca Thompson arrived at the Riverside Drive address at 7:47 a.m., just 5 minutes after the 911 call. The house was a modest 2-story frame home in a working-class neighborhood on Cleveland's west side, showing signs of deferred maintenance but generally well kept. She found Christopher Dixon sitting on the front steps, his thin frame wrapped in a jacket despite the mild November morning, his face pale and tear-streaked. "I'm Officer Thompson. You called 911? Thompson approached cautiously, her training in dealing with the traumatized witnesses guiding her initial interaction. "Yes. My mom is upstairs. I think she killed herself." Christopher's voice was hoarse, his body shaking in what appeared to be shock. "Is there anyone else in the house?" Thompson needed to secure the scene before entering. "No, just my mom. But she's not alive." Christopher's statement suggested he had already determined his mother was deceased. "Okay, I need you to stay right here while I check inside. Don't go anywhere." Thompson's instruction was both for Christopher's safety and to ensure he remained available for questioning. The officer entered the house with caution, hand near her service weapon, though the caller's report suggested suicide rather than an active threat. The lower level appeared. Orderly living room furniture arranged neatly. Kitchen showing the usual morning clutter. No signs of disturbance or struggle. A framed photograph on the mantel showed Michelle Dixon, visibly pregnant, smiling alongside a younger Christopher and a man Thompson assumed was the stepfather. Thompson proceeded up the stairs, following the hallway to what was clearly the master bedroom. The scene inside would immediately trigger her investigative instincts and raise serious questions about whether this was truly a suicide as Christopher had reported. Michelle Dixon lay in bed on her back, her head on a pillow that was saturated with blood. Her eyes were closed, her very pregnant belly visible under the blankets, her right hand resting on top of the covers. A 9mm handgun lay on the floor near the bed, positioned in a way that suggested it had fallen from the victim's hand. But several details immediately struck Thompson as inconsistent with suicide. The gunshot entry wound was behind Michelle's right ear rather than at the temple or under the chin where most suicide gunshot wounds occur. Michelle's right hand showed no blood or gunpowder residue visible to the naked eye, which would be expected if she had fired a gun that close to her head. And the position of the gun on the floor seemed staged, too perfectly placed, too far from where it would naturally fall if dropped from a hand. "Dispatch, I have a code 5 at this location. Female victim, approximately 30s, appears to be 8 to 9 months pregnant. Single gunshot wound to the head. Scene is suspicious for homicide staged as suicide. Send homicide detectives, CSI, and medical examiner. Thompson's radio transmission transformed the investigation from a reported suicide to a potential murder case. Detective Marcus Williams of the Cleveland Police Department's Homicide Unit arrived at 8:15 a.m. His 18 years of experience immediately activated as he surveyed the scene. At 44, Williams had investigated hundreds of deaths, natural, accidental, suicide, and homicide, and his trained eye quickly identified the inconsistencies that suggested this was murder staged to look like suicide. "Walk me through what we have," Williams said to Officer Thompson, who provided a briefing on Christopher's 911 call and what she had found. 13-year-old son, Christopher Dixon, called 911 reporting he found his mother dead with a gunshot wound. He told the dispatcher and me that he thinks she killed herself. But the scene has multiple red flags for staging wound location, gun position, lack of visible blood or GSR on the victim's hand. Stepfather is at work, confirmed by his employer. Mother was 8 months pregnant according to family photos. Thompson's summary immediately established the suspicious nature of the scene. Where's the son now? Williams' first instinct was to secure Christopher's statement before he had time to construct a more sophisticated story, if he was indeed responsible. On the front porch with another officer. He seems genuinely shaken up, but something feels off about his presentation. The crying seems performative. Thompson's observation reflected her intuitive sense that Christopher's distress might not be authentic. Williams approached Christopher, who remained sitting on the porch steps, now flanked by officers to ensure he didn't leave or contaminate evidence. The detective's first impression was of how young Christopher appeared, small for his age, baby-faced, looking more like 10 or 11 than 13. It was difficult to imagine this childlike figure as a killer, but Williams had learned long ago not to make assumptions based on appearance. "Christopher, I'm Detective Williams. I know this is an incredibly difficult situation, but I need to ask you some questions about what happened. Can you tell me about this morning?" Williams' approach was gentle, not yet confrontational, gathering Christopher's account before challenging it with evidence. "I woke up around 7:30 for school. I got dressed and went to check if my mom was awake because she usually makes me breakfast. When I went into her room, I found her—" Christopher's voice broke, fresh tears spilling down his face. "She was just lying there. There was blood, and the gun was on the floor. I didn't know what to do, so I called 911. Had your mom been depressed? Had she talked about hurting herself?" Williams probed for information about Michelle's mental state that might support or contradict a suicide theory. "She was stressed about the baby coming, and she and my stepdad had been fighting lately. But I didn't think I never thought she would do something like this." Christopher's response provided a potential motive for suicide while positioning himself as a shocked and innocent witness. "Where were you last night? What time did you go to bed?" The detective began establishing Christopher's timeline and opportunity. "I went to bed around 10:30. My mom was still up watching TV. My stepdad left for work around 11. He works overnight security at a warehouse. I was in my room all night until I woke up this morning." Christopher's account suggested he and his mother had been alone in the house overnight after the stepfather left for work. "Did you hear anything unusual during the night? A gunshot would be pretty loud." Williams's question tested whether Christopher would acknowledge hearing the gunshot or claim to have slept through his mother's death. "I didn't hear anything. I'm a heavy sleeper. I had my fan on for white noise." Christopher's explanation was plausible but convenient, establishing that he could have been unaware of his mother's death until morning, despite being in the house. Williams noted Christopher's composed responses despite his tears. For a 13-year-old who had just discovered his mother's body, Christopher was remarkably articulate, and his narrative was surprisingly smooth. But these were subtle impressions, not enough to immediately shift him from traumatized witness to suspect without forensic evidence. The detective's questioning was interrupted by the arrival of Michelle Dixon's husband and Christopher's stepfather, Derek Morrison, who had been contacted at work and driven home by a police officer. Derek's reaction upon being told his wife was dead was the raw, uncontrolled grief Williams had seen countless times from genuine bereaved family members: denial, collapse, desperate questions about what had happened. It stood in stark contrast to Christopher's more controlled emotional display. As Derek was consoled by victim advocates and prevented from contaminating the crime scene by entering the house, Detective Williams continued supervising the forensic processing that would either support or undermine Christopher's suicide narrative. What the investigators found would paint a very different picture from what Christopher had reported. Crime scene investigators worked meticulously, photographing and documenting every aspect of Michelle's bedroom and the surrounding areas. The forensic evidence they collected over the next several hours would systematically dismantle Christopher's story and point inexorably toward murder. The gunshot residue analysis on Michelle's hands came back negative. No GSR particles were detected on her right hand, despite Christopher's claim that she had shot herself. For someone to fire a gun at close range, particularly when the muzzle is pressed against or very near the head, GSR particles would be deposited on the hand holding the weapon. The absence of GSR on Michelle's hand strongly suggested she had not fired the gun. More significantly, the angle of the gunshot wound was inconsistent with the self-inflicted injury. The medical examiner's preliminary examination revealed that the bullet had entered behind Michelle's right ear at a slightly downward angle, a trajectory that would be extremely difficult for someone to achieve shooting themselves, and which was far more consistent with someone else shooting her while she lay on the pillow. This wound pattern is not consistent with suicide, Dr. Robert Chen, the medical examiner, told Detective Williams during his initial examination at the scene. Suicide victims who shoot themselves in the head typically place the gun at the temple, under the chin, or in the mouth. This entry point behind the ear at a downward angle would require an awkward and unnatural arm position if self-inflicted. Combined with the absence of GSR on the victim's hand, I'm ruling this a homicide. The gun itself told an important story. Fingerprint analysis revealed no prints on the weapon. It had been wiped clean. This detail alone virtually eliminated suicide as a possibility. Why would someone committing suicide wipe their fingerprints from the gun? The only logical explanation was that someone else had fired the weapon, and then attempted to remove evidence of their handling it. "Detective, you need to see this," called out CSI technician Sarah Martinez from Christopher's bedroom, which was being processed as part of the comprehensive scene documentation. Williams entered to find Martinez examining items recovered from Christopher's closet. "What am I looking at?" Williams moved closer to where Martinez was photographing and bagging evidence. Clothing with what appears to be blood-spattered jeans and a t-shirt, balled up and hidden in the back of the closet under other clothes. Preliminary testing indicates human blood. Martinez carefully placed the clothing into evidence bags, preserving them for DNA analysis. Also found this. Martinez indicated a laptop computer on Christopher's desk. "We'll need to get forensics to examine it, but I did a quick check of the search history from last night. Multiple searches about how gunshot wounds look, whether people with gunshot wounds bleed a lot, and this is the really concerning one: can a 13-year-old go to prison for murder?" The evidence was mounting rapidly. Blood-spattered clothing hidden in Christopher's room. Internet searches about gunshot wounds and juvenile murder charges conducted hours before Michelle's death. No GSR on the victim's hands. Wound angle inconsistent with suicide. Gun wiped clean of prints. The supposed suicide was clearly a staged homicide, and all evidence pointed to Christopher as the perpetrator. Additional evidence discovered during the search would prove even more damning. In Christopher's school backpack, investigators found a notebook containing disturbing writings and drawings. One page featured a crude sketch of a stick figure lying in bed with red marker indicating blood, labeled "Problem Solved." Another page contained a list titled "Why My Life Would Be Better," with entries including "No more baby," "No more rules," "Can do what I want," and "Derek will let me do whatever." Most chilling was a timeline written on a torn piece of notebook paper, apparently mapping out Christopher's plan. 10:30. Go to bed, pretend to sleep 11 hours. Derek leaves for work 12 hours. Wait to make sure everyone is asleep. 1 nuts. Get the gun from Derek's nightstand. Do it while she's sleeping so she doesn't scream. Wipe off fingerprints. Put gun on floor like it fell. Go back to bed. Wake up normal time and find her. Call 911 crying. The timeline matched the medical examiner's estimated time of death, between midnight and 2 hours a.m., and documented premeditation in Christopher's own handwriting. This wasn't an impulsive act of a child losing control. It was planned, deliberate murder with specific steps designed to stage the scene and establish an alibi. "We have enough for an arrest," Detective Williams told his partner after reviewing the totality of evidence collected during the scene processing. The kid planned this, executed it, staged it as suicide, and called 911 playing the traumatized son. But he's 13 years old. This is going to be complicated. At 2:30 p.m., approximately 7 hours after Christopher's 911 call, Detective Williams placed him under arrest for the murder of Michelle Dixon. Given Christopher's age, the arrest required special protocols including notification of Child Protective Services and ensuring that all questioning would be conducted with appropriate safeguards for a juvenile suspect. Christopher Dixon, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of your mother, Michelle Dixon, Williams stated formally, reading Christopher his Miranda rights in language modified to ensure a 13-year-old would understand. You have the right to remain silent. That means you don't have to answer any questions if you don't want to. You have the right to have a lawyer present before and during any questioning. If you cannot afford a lawyer, one will be provided for you at no cost. Do you understand these rights?" Christopher's reaction to the arrest was telling. Rather than shocked denial or continued grief, his expression shifted to something harder calculation rather than innocence. "I want a lawyer," he said immediately, showing awareness of legal protections unusual for a 13-year-old, but consistent with someone who had researched criminal consequences before committing murder. As Christopher was transported to juvenile detention, investigators continued building the case by interviewing family members, teachers, and others who might provide context for understanding why a 13-year-old would murder his pregnant mother. What they learned would paint a picture of a deeply troubled child, a dysfunctional family, and warning signs that had been overlooked or ignored until they culminated in tragedy. The investigation into Christopher Dixon's background and the Dixon family dynamics revealed a troubled household marked by conflict, resentment, and Christopher's escalating behavioral problems that had gone largely unaddressed. Michelle Dixon had been a single mother for most of Christopher's childhood after his biological father, James Dixon, had abandoned the family when Christopher was 3 years old. She had worked multiple jobs to support them, often leaving Christopher with relatives or neighbors while she worked long hours. 2 years ago, Michelle had married Derek Morrison, a warehouse security guard who earned a modest income that allowed Michelle to reduce her work hours. The marriage was Michelle's attempt to provide stability and a father figure for Christopher, but the blended family had been marked by conflict from the start. Christopher resented Derek's presence and his attempts to impose structure and discipline. "Christopher never accepted me as a parental figure," Derek told investigators during an interview the day after Michelle's murder. His eyes red from crying, but his account clear and detailed. "He would openly defy me, tell me I wasn't his father and couldn't tell him what to do. Michelle tried to support my authority, but Christopher would manipulate her, play the victim, make her feel guilty for choosing Derek over him," as he put it. Derek described escalating conflict over the past 6 months as Michelle's pregnancy progressed. When Michelle got pregnant, Christopher became even more hostile. He said things like, "You're replacing me and you care more about the new baby than me." We tried to reassure him, tried to include him in pregnancy preparations, but he wanted nothing to do with it. He would say horrible things about the baby, about how he wished it would die, about how the baby was ruining his life. School records painted a picture of Christopher's behavioral decline over the previous 2 years. His elementary school years had been relatively unremarkable, but middle school had brought increasing problems. Teachers reported that Christopher was defiant, manipulative, and showed concerning lack of empathy for others. Christopher would hurt other students not physically aggressive, but psychological cruelty, reported his 7th grade teacher, Jennifer Walsh. He would identify other kids' vulnerabilities and exploit them. He seemed to enjoy seeing them upset. When I would try to address it, he would deny everything with a completely straight face, even when multiple witnesses had seen what he did. He was a sophisticated liar for his age. The school counselor had documented concerns about Christopher's behavior and had recommended psychological evaluation. I met with Christopher 3 times last semester after incidents where he had hurt other students emotionally, explained counselor Dr. David Martinez. He showed no genuine remorse, only performed what he thought remorse should look like. When I asked how he thought his actions made other students feel, he would give textbook, correct answers. But they were clearly memorized responses rather than authentic empathy. I recommended to his mother that he receive a comprehensive psychological evaluation, but I don't believe it was ever followed up on. Financial records showed that Michelle and Derek were struggling economically, living paycheck to paycheck with mounting debt. The pregnancy had added stress, both financial and emotional. Christopher had apparently perceived the coming baby as a threat not just to his relationship with his mother, but to his material well-being, fearing that resources would go to the baby rather than to him. Most disturbing were discoveries on Christopher's laptop and phone that revealed the depth of his resentment and the premeditation of his crime. Beyond the searches about gunshot wounds and juvenile murder charges on the night of the killing, forensic analysis uncovered weeks of prior searches and social media activity documenting Christopher's state of mind. Search history from October 15, 2022, 3 weeks before the murder. Can you get a baby removed before it's born? What happens if a pregnant woman dies? Does the baby die? How to make it look like suicide. Search history from October 28, 2022. Where do people keep guns? In their house. Do guns have fingerprints? Can 13-year-olds be tried as adults? Search history from November 7, 2022, the night before the murder. How loud is a gunshot? Do people wake up if shot in the head? What happens to kids who kill their parents? Christopher had also been active in online forums, posting anonymously about his situation in ways that demonstrated his resentment while carefully avoiding explicit threats that might have triggered intervention. On a Reddit discussion forum about family problems, Christopher had posted under a throwaway account. My mom is pregnant, and everyone acts like this baby is the most important thing in the world. Nobody cares about me anymore. It's like I don't even exist. I hate this baby, and I haven't even been born yet. My life would be so much better if the baby just went away, and if my mom went away too because she's the one who chose to have a baby instead of caring about me. In another forum post from 2 weeks before the murder, Christopher had written, Has anyone ever just wanted to end their problem permanently? Like not run away, but actually solve it so it's gone forever? I think about it all the time. Getting rid of the sources of my problems so I can just be happy and do what I want without people controlling me and disappointing me. These posts, combined with the physical evidence and the timeline found in his notebook, demonstrated that Christopher had been contemplating and planning his mother's murder for weeks. This wasn't an impulsive act born of sudden rage, it was premeditated, calculated homicide by a 13-year-old who had systematically prepared to kill his mother and stage it as suicide. Based on this overwhelming evidence, the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office filed first-degree murder charges against Christopher Dixon. However, the prosecutor's office faced the additional complication of determining whether to seek to transfer Christopher's case from juvenile court to adult court. a decision that would have profound implications for the potential sentence he could receive. Under Ohio law, juvenile offenders aged 10 or older can be transferred to adult court for certain serious offenses, including murder. But the decision requires a transfer hearing where the juvenile court judge determines whether the interests of justice are best served by adult or juvenile prosecution. The factors include the sophistication and maturity of the juvenile, the circumstances of the offense, the juvenile's prior record, and the likelihood of rehabilitation within the juvenile system. Prosecutor Amanda Roberts made the difficult decision to file a motion seeking transfer to adult court, arguing that Christopher's sophistication in planning and staging the murder warranted adult prosecution despite his 13-year-old age. This was not a child acting impulsively. This was a calculated murder planned over weeks, with specific steps taken to avoid detection. The evidence demonstrates adult-level criminal sophistication that justifies adult prosecution, Roberts wrote in her transfer motion. The transfer hearing would become the first major legal battle, with Christopher's defense team arguing passionately that a 13-year-old should remain in juvenile court regardless of the crime, while prosecutors presented evidence that Christopher's planning and execution of the murder reflected adult criminal thinking that warranted adult consequences. The transfer hearing took place in February 2023, 3 months after Michelle Dixon's murder, before juvenile court judge Patricia Martinez. The proceeding would determine whether Christopher would face trial in juvenile court with a maximum sentence of incarceration until age 21, or adult court, where he could potentially receive life without parole. Prosecutor Amanda Roberts's case for transfer emphasized the premeditation, the sophistication of the staging, and Christopher's psychological profile. Your Honor, this case involves a level of planning and criminal sophistication that far exceeds typical juvenile offenses. Christopher Dixon researched murder methods and legal consequences for weeks. He created a written timeline for executing the murder. He waited until his stepfather left for work to ensure his mother was isolated. He shot her while she slept. He wiped the gun clean and staged it to look like suicide. Then he called 911 and performed grief to establish himself as a traumatized witness. This is not childhood impulsivity. This is adult-level criminal calculation. Roberts presented testimony from forensic psychologist Dr. Jennifer Foster, who had evaluated Christopher and concluded that he demonstrated psychological characteristics concerning enough to warrant adult prosecution. Based on my comprehensive evaluation of Christopher Dixon, including clinical interviews, psychological testing, and review of collateral information, I find that he demonstrates characteristics consistent with conduct disorder and emerging antisocial personality features, Dr. Foster testified. His lack of genuine empathy, his sophisticated manipulation and lying, and his apparent absence of remorse are highly concerning. While personality is still developing at age 13, Christopher's specific profile suggests a significant risk that cannot be adequately addressed in the limited time frame of juvenile jurisdiction. In your professional opinion, is Christopher amenable to treatment in the juvenile justice system? Roberts asked, addressing the key question for transfer decisions. In my opinion, the juvenile system's resources and time frame are likely insufficient. Christopher would age out of juvenile jurisdiction at 21 just 8 years from now. Given the severity of his antisocial characteristics and the limited evidence that such traits respond quickly to intervention, 8 years is unlikely to be adequate to address his dangerousness and ensure public safety. Adult prosecution would allow for extended incarceration and treatment beyond age 21, which is more appropriate given his profile. Dr. Foster's testimony provided clinical support for the prosecution's argument. Defense attorney Maria Santos vigorously opposed the transfer, arguing that Christopher's age necessitated keeping him in juvenile court despite the severity of the crime. Your Honor, Christopher Dixon is 13 years old, 7th grade. Whatever he did, whatever the evidence shows, he remains a child under the law. The juvenile justice system exists precisely for situations like this, serious crimes committed by young people who still have significant developmental growth ahead of them, and who therefore have greater capacity for rehabilitation than adults. Santos presented her own expert, Dr. Michael Rodriguez, a child psychiatrist specializing in adolescent development, who testified that 13-year-olds lack the cognitive and emotional maturity of adults even when they engage in sophisticated behavior. While Christopher planned this offense, that planning emerged from an adolescent brain that lacks full development of the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for impulse control, judgment, and consideration of long-term consequences. Adolescents can engage in goal-directed planning without possessing adult-level capacity for understanding the full magnitude and permanence of their actions. The defense also called Christopher's former elementary school teachers and a family member who testified about his positive qualities and the trauma of his early childhood that might have contributed to his behavioral problems. Christopher's biological father abandoned him when he was very young. He grew up in poverty with his mother working constantly just to keep them housed and fed. He lacked stability and consistent parental presence during critical developmental years. These adverse childhood experiences have lasting impacts on brain development and behavior, testified Dr. Rodriguez, attempting to provide mitigating context. The most emotionally powerful testimony came from Derek Morrison, Christopher's stepfather, who had lost his wife and unborn child. Derek's testimony was complicated. He sought justice for Michelle, but also struggled with the question of whether condemning a 13-year-old to adult prison was right. Christopher killed my wife and my unborn child. That is unforgivable, Derek testified, tears streaming down his face. But he's also 13 years old. I keep thinking about whether the adult system is the right response, whether there's any chance he could change with proper help. I honestly don't know. I want justice for Michelle, but I don't know if putting a 13-year-old in adult prison accomplishes that or just creates more tragedy. Derek's conflicted testimony reflected the profound moral complexity of the case, acknowledging the severity of Christopher's crime, while questioning whether adult prosecution of such a young child could be just regardless of what he had done. Judge Martinez took the case under advisement, issuing her decision 3 weeks later in a detailed written ruling that would grant the prosecution's motion to transfer Christopher to adult court. The decision acknowledged the difficulty of condemning someone so young to adult prosecution, but found that the evidence supported transfer. This court has carefully considered all factors required by Ohio law for determining whether transfer to adult court is appropriate, Judge Martinez wrote. The sophistication demonstrated by the defendant's weeks of planning, his research into murder methods and staging techniques, his documented timeline for executing the crime, and his performance of grief to establish himself as a witness all demonstrate criminal sophistication far exceeding typical juvenile offenses. The circumstances and gravity of the offense premeditated murder of his pregnant mother, resulting in 2 deaths, are among the most serious crimes recognized by law. Judge Martinez specifically addressed the rehabilitation question. While the defendant's age weighs heavily against transfer, the psychological evidence suggests that his emerging antisocial characteristics may not be amenable to treatment within the 8-year window available in juvenile jurisdiction. The protection of public safety and the interests of justice require that the defendant face adult prosecution, where the full range of sentencing options and treatment timeframes are available. The transfer decision meant Christopher would stand trial in adult criminal court for 2 counts of aggravated murder, Michelle and the unborn baby under Ohio's fetal homicide law, facing potential sentences up to life without parole. His defense team immediately appealed, but Ohio appellate courts had consistently upheld transfers in cases involving planned murders by juveniles, and Christopher's case presented particularly strong grounds for transfer given the extensive premeditation evidence. The trial began in July 2023, 8 months after Michelle Dixon's murder. The case had attracted significant media attention both locally and nationally, with coverage focusing on the disturbing question of how a 13-year-old could plan and execute his pregnant mother's murder. Judge Thomas Harrison would preside, and a jury of 12 with 3 alternates would determine Christopher's guilt or innocence, and, if convicted, recommend a sentence. Prosecutor Amanda Roberts's opening statement was direct and methodical, laying out the timeline of premeditation and the overwhelming evidence of Christopher's guilt. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about a 13-year-old boy who murdered his pregnant mother because he was jealous of the attention she was giving to her unborn baby. Christopher Dixon planned this murder for weeks. He researched methods online. He created a written timeline. He waited until his stepfather left for work. He took the gun from his stepfather's nightstand, went to his mother's bedroom while she slept, and shot her in the head. Then he wiped the gun clean, positioned it to look like she had shot herself, changed his clothes, hid the bloody clothing, and went to bed. The next morning, he called 911, pretending to have just discovered her body, crying and claiming she must have committed suicide. Roberts previewed the overwhelming evidence, the staged suicide scene, the blood-spattered clothing hidden in Christopher's closet, the internet searches, the timeline in his notebook, the lack of GSR on Michelle's hands, the wound angle inconsistent with suicide. The defense will ask you to focus on Christopher's age, but the evidence will show that age 13 did not prevent him from engaging in sophisticated criminal planning, execution, and staging that many adults could not accomplish. He knew what he was doing. He knew it was wrong. That's why he tried so hard to make it look like suicide. And he must be held accountable. defense attorney Maria Santos faced an enormous challenge defending a client whose guilt was essentially established by overwhelming evidence while trying to generate sympathy based on his age. Her opening statement acknowledged the evidence while emphasizing Christopher's youth and the developmental science showing that adolescents should not be judged by adult standards. Christopher Dixon is 13 years old. 13. Whatever happened in that house, whatever the evidence shows, we cannot forget that fundamental fact. The law recognizes that children are different from adults. They think differently. They process emotions differently. Their brains are still developing in ways that affect judgment and impulse control. The prosecution wants you to see an adult-level criminal. I'm asking you to see what's really there, a deeply troubled child from a dysfunctional family who made a catastrophic decision, but who still has the capacity for growth and change that we deny when we treat him as if he were an adult. The prosecution's case proceeded systematically. Detective Williams testified about the investigation, the staged suicide scene, and the discovery of evidence proving Christopher's guilt. The medical examiner explained why Michelle's death was homicide, not suicide, based on wound angle and absence of GSR. Forensic experts presented the blood evidence, the internet searches, the timeline Christopher had written. Perhaps most damaging was testimony about Christopher's behavior after the murder. A teacher who had interacted with him the day before Michelle's death described him as cheerful and normal, showing no signs of distress, contradicting any notion that he was in crisis or acting impulsively. The 911 dispatcher testified about Christopher's call, noting that while he sounded upset, his narrative was remarkably composed and detailed for someone who had just made such a horrific discovery. The prosecution rested after presenting a comprehensive case establishing premeditation, opportunity, and a complete lack of credible alternative explanation. The defense's case focused almost entirely on Christopher's age and expert testimony about adolescent development, since challenging the factual evidence of his guilt was impossible. Dr. Michael Rodriguez returned to testify about adolescent brain development and the differences between 13-year-olds and adults in terms of cognitive capacity, emotional regulation, and moral reasoning. However, his testimony was undermined by Christopher's sophisticated planning and staging, which demonstrated cognitive capacities seemingly inconsistent with the limitations Rodriguez described. The defense's most critical decision was whether to have Christopher testify. Santos strongly advised against it, knowing that Christopher's lack of genuine remorse would be devastating to any possibility of jury sympathy. But Christopher insisted, apparently believing he could manipulate the jury as he had attempted to manipulate police. Christopher's testimony was brief and disastrous. Under Santos's questioning, he presented a narrative claiming that he didn't mean to kill his mother, that the gun went off accidentally when he was just looking at it in his parents' room in the middle of the night, and that he panicked and staged the suicide scene out of fear. This new story contradicted all the premeditation evidence and was transparently false. Roberts's cross-examination was brief but devastating. Christopher, you testified that this was an accident, but you wrote a timeline planning the murder. How do you explain that? I was just writing. It didn't mean anything, Christopher responded, the same explanation failing that had failed suspects countless times before. You researched. can a 13-year-old go to prison for murder, hours before your mother died? Why would you research that if you weren't planning to kill her? I don't know. I was just curious about random stuff. Christopher's explanations grew weaker as Roberts systematically dismantled his testimony. You showed no remorse when arrested. You immediately asked for a lawyer instead of showing grief for your mother. Does that sound like someone who accidentally killed their mother? Christopher had no good answer, his testimony collapsing under the weight of evidence contradicting his new narrative. As he was excused from the stand, several jurors shook their heads, their expressions suggesting his testimony had eliminated any remaining sympathy his age might have generated. Closing arguments reinforced the competing narratives. Roberts emphasized the premeditation and Christopher's sophisticated criminal planning. Santos emphasized his age and theoretical capacity for rehabilitation. The jury deliberated for 7 hours before returning guilty verdicts on both counts of aggravated murder. Christopher showed no reaction to the verdicts, his face remaining blank in the way that had characterized his demeanor throughout the trial. The sentencing phase would now begin, where the jury would recommend either life with the possibility of parole after 30 years, or life without possibility of parole. The sentencing phase featured extensive testimony about appropriate punishment. The prosecution presented Christopher's complete lack of remorse, his manipulation and lying, and expert opinion that he posed a permanent danger. The defense presented evidence about brain development and rehabilitation potential. Most powerfully, Derek Morrison provided victim impact testimony about Michelle and the unborn baby. Michelle was excited about this baby. She had names picked out. She was preparing the nursery. She talked to her belly every night, telling our daughter about the life she would have. Christopher took all of that away, not just from Michelle and our baby, but from me, from Michelle's parents, from everyone who loved them. The jury recommended life without possibility of parole, finding that Christopher's planning, his lack of remorse, and his dangerous psychological profile warranted the maximum sentence. Judge Harrison scheduled formal sentencing for 2 weeks later. On August 15, 2023, Judge Harrison delivered the sentence that would shock the nation. Christopher Dixon, you have been convicted by a jury of 2 counts of aggravated murder. The jury has recommended life imprisonment without possibility of parole. After careful consideration, this court accepts that recommendation and imposes that sentence. Judge Harrison continued with words that would define Christopher's future. You will never leave this prison. You will spend the rest of your natural life behind bars. You murdered your pregnant mother while she slept. You murdered your unborn sibling. You showed no remorse, no recognition of the magnitude of what you did. At age 13, you demonstrated a capacity for calculated violence and callous manipulation that justifies this permanent sentence. You will die in prison. The words hung in the courtroom as Christopher stood motionless, his fate sealed at age 13. Appeals would follow, challenging the sentence as cruel and unusual punishment for a juvenile. But for Christopher Dixon, his childhood had effectively ended the night he shot his mother, replaced by a life behind bars that would extend until his natural death decades in the future. The case remains one of the most controversial juvenile sentences in American history. Cited in debates about juvenile justice, criminal responsibility, and whether any 13-year-old can truly be irredeemable regardless of their crime. But for Michelle Dixon and her unborn daughter, the debate comes too late. They were murdered by someone who should have loved them, someone who was still a child himself, but who demonstrated a capacity for violence that destroyed multiple families and shocked a nation.